Okay, welcome back to part two, population and settlement. So remember we talked about 43% of the population being under the age of 15, generally speaking for this region. So on the left is exactly what we're speaking, a very triangular population pyramid. Um, because of that, the population is expected to double by 2050. So if you go back to thinking about when chapter one we talked about during the second week of class, where we talked about population doubling time, for example. So this region is a very short doubling time, one of the fastest in the world. So it's a very young population. However, we still do see very low life expectancies, especially for the areas that tend to have high fertility rates. On the right, you can see South Africa, which is a much more stable country, generally speaking, politically and economically stable, improved development standards compared to other areas. And this is probably mostly associated with its, partially its access to the where it is located. It's not a landlocked country, but another large factor is its relationship with other former European colonies. So some of the demographic trends we're seeing, so we have seen a decline in child mortality. It's still quite high. We are starting to see trends of changes in life expectancy, so life expectancy is starting to go up. However, family size, the total fertility rate is still pretty close to the natural maximum, about 5.1 kids. And this is partly, if you go back and think about the demographic transition model and try and understand where they were, so we're still seeing we're seeing death rates decline, but we're still seeing high birth rates. So this is still largely related to cultural preference, rural lifestyles, again, like a built-in social security for parents and for families. So if you go back and think of demographic transmission model, this is phase. Maybe remember this? There will be some questions on your chest about this. This is about phase two. So one of the big factors that we see in this region that we don't necessarily see in other regions is the disease factor. So if you remember from a few years ago, we had the huge Ebola outbreak. And globalization is definitely bringing a new aspect to this. There's advantages where there's more access to healthcare and medicine, yet at the same time, we're also seeing more access to the diseases being able to spread much easier, especially from a global level. Malaria is largely considered a disease of poverty. Malaria is a mosquito-borne disease. If people, things as simple as mosquito nets have saved millions of lives. Malaria doesn't have to be deadly. It can be deadly, especially in people with weak immune systems and children, elderly. There's a long history of spraying for. It's a negative feedback loop where you spray for mosquitoes and then the strong mosquitoes tend to survive, and those are the ones that reproduce, and those are the ones that are resistant to the pesticide, and now it's even harder to kill the mosquitoes, which is one of the issues with using pesticides. And malaria was a disease that largely kept people, outsiders, outside. They weren't, you would die if Europeans weren't able to survive very long. There's actually sickle cell anemia is much more likely and much more prevalent in Black people and African people of African descent. And this is actually biologically believed to have developed people who are recessive, so have one dominant and one recessive gene for sickle cell anemia, are actually immune to malaria. So this is something like a bit of a natural selection that has occurred over time, but it is a disease that is much more prevalent as well in people of African descent. HIV and AIDS, so AIDS being, as you know, it's a virus and then it turns into a syndrome, which is it's an autoimmune disease, and that's what basically most people die of related issues, not necessarily related to the virus. But 70% of all of the world's cases are in this region. The disease originally is from the Congo. There has been some interesting documentaries made about patient zero, and I think they believe they can trace them back to about the 1920s or 30s, if I'm not mistaken. And again, they believe it was transmitted from monkeys. don't remember if it was, I know there's been different ideas and hypotheses over time, if it was from eating monkey or maybe a monkey was bit a human. There are a lot of social and economic implications for this region. Again, you have lower life expectancy, largely related to HIV and AIDS for many countries. The economic burden for families of people being sick and not being able to work. There's still a lot of social stigmas related to the disease. However, the rates of transmission have been going down. So there's a lot of hopeful signs, and hopefully we'll see changes over generations. As not necessarily, of course, it's a disease that can't be cured, but we are seeing rates of transmission decreasing. Just talk a little bit about the Ebola outbreaks. So the last big outbreak was 2014 to 15, largely in West Africa. So you have Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea were the main points. There's no cure technically available. They have been able to cure some of the people, at least they believe they have. Not everybody dies from it. I can't remember exactly, but I believe they were able to create some type of antibodies from the people who had survived and create some type of serum that they experimentally used on some of the medical staff who had returned from this region. And then once they were in the States, they realized they had Ebola. And this has been there's pros and cons. It's a good example of a lot of international cooperation to try and contain the disease and not let it spread around the world. But again, this is a disease that is, it's largely, you can see here the number of total deaths and the number of total cases. So we're looking at, in Liberia, 4,800 deaths, in Sierra Leone, almost 4,000, 2,500 in Guinea. You can see where the hot spots were, the darker orange, where they had up to 4,000 people in each of those regions of the country. I'm assuming those are going to be like provinces or states. So this is a very poor region of the world, and therefore medical companies and technology companies, there's not a lot of incentive for them to be working on vaccines and treatment for Ebola, because it's not something that has spread to other countries that have a lot more health insurance and money to buy into these treatments. Unfortunately, disparities even there. So some patterns of settlement and land use. Overall, this region is not densely populated. So you can see there's very specific areas where people are, where it's populated, and then there's quite a few areas that don't have anybody living. Maybe nomadic peoples living in some of those regions. Timbuktu is all the way up here. If you weren't sure, I have a couple pictures later. Most people don't realize that Timbuktu is actually a place all the way up here in Mali, if I'm not mistaken. And again, we're seeing huge rates of urban growth, so rates of urbanization. But you can see here again, there's not a lot of large cities, especially compared to other regions of the world. Those that are large do have quite a few people in them. So we still see a lot of subsistence agriculture, which is, you do need to know this for your test. So subsistence agriculture is people basically growing. These are actually cacao pods up there. Sorry, off topic. You can see them cutting open the cacao pods. And then the pastoralists down in the bottom, which are like nomadic herders. Subsistence agriculture is people who are growing agricultural products primarily for self-consumption, for their own consumption, and not necessarily to sell. Swidden is a type of agriculture where you use shifting cultivation. So you shift cultivation between one plot of land, you let it go fallow, you let it rest, and then you switch to another plot of land. Sometimes there's cover crops that are used, or different methods that try to leave the land, for example, a slash and burn method where you burn what is there and you let the ash fertilize, and then you plant a crop and then you leave it fallow. Generally, this type of agriculture cannot support large populations or high population numbers. Export agriculture, so most of the countries have only 1 to 2 crops per country that they export. So again, largely, excuse me, largely primary economic activities and a monoculture, plantation type of ideas. So pastoralists are these people who have livestock and they go from area to area. You can think of the Maasai, for example, in Eastern Africa. And the tsetse fly, so there still this is the sleeping disease, they call it. It's a fly that will bite you. It's still very common in a lot of the country, and even locals are not immune to it. So this is something that even locals have to be concerned of. So urban life. This is, while it is one of the fastest urban growing areas, it's the least urbanized region in the developing world. So with this, we're seeing a lot of urban sprawl, and we'll talk about this a bit more. We did talk this quite a bit in North America, but a lot of urban sprawl. We also see urban primacy. So if you remember when we talked about in Latin America, one city being disproportionately larger, usually about 4 times larger than the next largest country. And we still do see a lot of West African urban traditions. So here's a couple examples. We have a slum up on the right, some of the kind of what we talked about for Latin America, but a lot of hybrid cities. So cities that are growing, cities that might have, we don't necessarily associate this region with being urbanized. Historically speaking, we tend to think of urbanization being introduced with Europeans, but that's not actually true. And then here we have an example of an elite neighborhood, which can be very common for a lot of developing nations. You have upper income, very gated, isolated communities. Um, Here's a couple different examples. On the right, we actually have Timbuktu. And then on the bottom, these are different types of buildings you would find in Timbuktu using traditional architecture. So very non-Western. And then you have more modern, this is an example of our apartheid. So one of the things that your book will talk about here is the impact of apartheid on actually forming urbanization. So you can look at, there's different, apartheid, if you're not aware, I'm not going to go into it too much, your book goes into quite a bit, was South African. There was actual law that separated people based on color, white back, and then half mixed race as well. And again, this was largely influenced where you could live, much like what we talk about in the States, but much more formal designations. So we talk about issues of racism in the States. This was down to neighborhoods and sections as well. So cultural coherence and diversity. So largely speaking, and this is something that a lot of us don't think of, we think of Africa, we think of people generally of the same race, but we don't understand that a lot of the conflict goes back to the fact that there's not a lot of cultural cohesion, not a lot of linguistic cohesion. This is a region that is largely been affected by colonialism. So this is what we're calling a lack of cultural and political coherence, and I'll show you some maps that kind of explain why. Another thing that we often talk about is we think about slavery in terms of slaves coming to North America or South America or the Caribbean. We don't necessarily think about where the slaves came from and what kind of impact that would have had in the region that it came from. So sub-Saharan African identity was largely created through a couple of different factors. First of all, slavery and colonial history. These are huge factors. Struggles for independence and development. And then what we'd refer to more as today, resilience and optimism. So this shows us a breakdown. I'm going to even show you a more broken down. But these are the multilingual, so very multilingual countries. I've had students come from Africa, and they often speak 7 or 8 languages. So this map shows us the language families, but a language family is not language, so these are different families. That might have a variety of language, so Romance, Indo-European, for example. So these are language groups that we'll see. The Niger-Congo, these belong to 2 language groups. In the Niger-Congo, Swahili are 2 of the large language groups. Down in the bottom left, we can also see a little in the inset there, you see the official languages for those countries. So we have Arabic, Amharic, English, French, Portuguese, Somali, Spanish, and Swahili. This is largely where countries, depending on which country they would have been colonized from. So language is largely associated with ethnic identity. Languages can be tribal, a lot of tribal indigenous languages that you might not even have a lot of speakers of. And then we also, as we saw, the introduction of European languages, which hold on to colonial legacies and often are still the official language of a region. But South Africa is a good example. Here's a sign from South Africa where it's very multilingual. So you have the top, we have English, and then you have I'm going to get this wrong. It might be Zulu, for example, and then Afrikaans, which is a mix of, um, it's mixed with Dutch, and it's mixed with a couple of other languages as well. Here is a language map based on tribal languages. So imagine if we wanted to divide the region based on tribal languages, as we tend to think of here. And this is very similar to what Papua New Guinea would look like as well. So you can see that the diversity of languages that exist. And then on the left is just a language map of the Democratic Republic of Congo. So you can see, realistically speaking, and this is like in here. So there's even, smaller. It's amazing how diverse, how many different languages exist in a small space. And this is why you get somebody who lives here, and maybe their mother's from this neighborhood, from this area, the father's from this area, but then they also have neighbors that speak different languages. So this is how you get people who speak 7, 8 languages. So religion, this is a animist religion is the term that your book uses to describe the religions in this world. It's a very misleading term. Generally speaking, it's kind of it's a phrase, or it's a term to identify all local faiths that don't necessarily fit into what we would refer to as normal world religions. So Abrahamic religions, which are Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, for example. There's usually a lot of worship based on nature and ancestral spirits. And again, there's a lot of internal diversity throughout the country, much as we would see with languages. So very tribal languages. And this term kind of refers more to about what it's not than what it is. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but the religions that we see, it's very diverse religion, but they're also religions that don't fit into, they don't conform to what we tend to think of as religions. Christianity, there is a lot of Islam and Christianity in the region. Christianity has been in the region for a great period of time. The earliest Christian settlements were in Northeast Africa, about 300 years after the Christian era, so CE. And then again, we saw an influx with European settlers and missionaries who brought Christianity back into the region, starting about 1600s. So the introduction and spread of Islam, this again is like a Berber, so a similar architecture we saw with Timbuktu. So Islam was largely introduced by North African traders into the Sahel region up here about 1,000 years ago, and it has spread quite successfully throughout the region. So you can see the green regions are Muslim majority, and then the light green is large Muslim minorities, but still largely Muslim countries. So you can see a huge part of this region is predominantly Muslim. We are seeing a lot of conflicts, a bit more modern conflicts that are religious in nature. So if you've ever heard of the group, this is largely in Nigeria, in northern Nigeria. There's 7 states that have Sharia laws. So Sharia law is a basically religious Islam law. So governments that are based, you think of Taliban in Afghanistan, for example. Boko Haram is the name of a fundamentalist government. There was about 200 or 300 schoolgirls who were kidnapped a few years ago, and there was a big movement to free our girls, or free the girls, something like this. A lot of them have been freed, but it's a terrorist in many. It's a government that has terrorized a lot of the people with a very strict political agenda as well. We talked at the beginning of part 1 about the new nation of South Sudan being created. Again, this was largely based on, not totally based on, but there was quite a bit of a religious conflict here between Islam and Christianity. So Christian minority and Muslim majority in the north, and then vice versa in the south. It's led to a lot of internally displaced people and now refugees as the country is divided. However, we do see rapid spread of both Christianity and Islam throughout the region. And then with this, the same as we talked about in Latin America, a lot of syncretic religions are emerging. So this blended between tribal, animistic religions and Western religions, or Abrahamic religions. So globalization. So one of the connections that we've talked about, I think a lot of people find this interesting too. So now we're looking at slavery um, from the African slave trade, I should say, but coming from the African perspective. So when we talked about Latin America, the amount going in, but we don't really talk about where they're coming from. So this is 1700 to 1870. There's also a lot of, as you can see, without reliable data, but slaves are also believed to have been taken to other regions as well. Globalization and African culture. This, I usually mean to take this out, but this is generally what most people associate. Nigeria, which most people aren't aware of, actually has quite a large uh, film industry. They call it Nollywood for Nigeria. And I think a lot of times what this region is largely familiar with is East African distance runners. So we usually think of marathon runners or runners in general in the Olympics. And then we have a barber festival in the desert. So again, there's drastic, and you can see here the drastic differences between this region. It's not just even the appearance of people. We tend not to think of being such a difference in cultures and livelihoods. Oh, sorry, it froze on me and now it jumped ahead. Okay, so geopolitics. This region has largely been influenced in today. A lot of the modern conflicts actually come from colonialism, so legacies of colonialism. Going back and looking at the history, this was the origins of our modern um, human species. So this is the origins of human ancestors. And there were many, so we don't really think about it, but there were many African states, early African states and kingdoms and rules that existed. So you can see the Zulus, the Swazis, the Marinas in Madagascar. But there were quite a few different groups, and many of these tribal groups still exist today. European colonization. So as I briefly mentioned, the region pretty much stayed protected because of disease. People couldn't stay there. Those who went and stayed got sick and died. And then something happened that we call the scramble for Africa. Quinine was invented, and the Berlin Conference, I believe it was maybe 12 players at the table. The United States was not there. They were 12, is it only, well, we only see 7 up here, but basically, we had a group of Europeans sit around a table at the Berlin Conference in Berlin, actually, in 1884, and they all decided to divvy up the continent, divvy up this region and divide who would get what and who would get where. And if you go back and think about that language map we had and how diverse it was, and now all of a sudden all of these groups of people are forced into one country. Now you are Nigerian. Now you are Liberia. It was different. Liberia is actually an interesting case. It's down here. I'll get to in a second. There was a lot of resistance. The Anglo-Zulu Wars, for example, lasted for quite a while. So there was a lot of resistance still. A lot of countries just didn't, roll over and give. Up to Ethiopia, the Union of South Africa. Ethiopia is really interesting. They've actually never fully, they've been able to fight off and really never colonized. Liberia is an interesting country as well. Liberia was actually formed by the United States. There were slaves who were freed and wanted to return. Or that makes it sound very Eurocentric. I I haven't read a whole lot about it. I'm not sure if they wanted to return or this is more of a what do we do with these people? Should we get rid of them? But anyway, so there was a period of time where this country was created. It's Liberia, based off, think of like liberty. So they're ex-slaves from the American colonies that were sent back. And then by 1847, it was a free country. So we started seeing a lot of the countries gain independence post-World Wars. They just couldn't hold on. Then by about 19 60s, most of the countries had become independent, most of the colonies. So again, decolonization started in about 1957, and it just kind of fell from there. And then most states were independent by the mid 1960s, so about 10 years later. Um, there's been there is a bit of an organization, so I should not be. There's something called the African Union. So again, it's based off like the European Union, for example. And the idea was that it's an organization to help mediate disputes between neighbor countries. And it hasn't necessarily been. I don't know a lot about its existence. I don't know a lot about um, its attempts to actually, because there has been a lot of conflict. This region has been is a region that's really largely struggled with conflict, and again, we'll talk about that here in a minute. Um, so what we see is in the patterns of, if you go back and think about that tribal map, if you're familiar with the genocide of Rwanda, um, that happened 1980s, late 80s, early 90s. Sorry, your book goes into a bit more specific dates. I'm not going to ask you specific dates, but there was a genocide. And is what's common is what we've seen with a lot of the colonization was that the ruling country would pick a tribal group, usually a minority, and place them in power and control. Well, they weren't necessarily fair leaders and rulers of the country. And when the country became independent and the outside rulers left, there became a shift in power, or an attempt to have a shift in power. And this is actually what led to largely it was a major factor in the Rwandan genocide. Um, and this has led to a lot of instability across the region, where we're looking at systemic institutions that were largely based on preferencing one tribal group or one group of people, one ethnic group of people over another. And then as the governments became independent, this has led to a huge shift, a lot of civil war, a lot of turmoil. Um, in some countries, your book presents this idea of tribalism, where people, again, think about that ethnic linguistic map. So people tend to be more loyal to their ethnic group instead of the state government, which again explains a lot of the conflict and turmoil that we've seen. It's not necessarily religious conflict, although there are cases of religious conflict today, especially with extremist Muslims. And then we also see high rates of refugees and internally displaced people. So refugees are people who flee the country, cross borders, and then internally displaced people are basically, if you will, just refugees who haven't left the country. They are internally displaced within their own country. So you can see, this is a little bit old, 2013 now, but you can see the number of internally displaced people and refugees from these countries. So there's quite a few, well into the millions for some of the countries. Something else, a lot of the groups, so a lot of secessionist movements, a lot of governments who have tried to, Somaliland is a good example. Somalia is a country that has there's a lot of militia governments, a lot of very dominant rule dictators in historically since decolonization as well of this region. And a lot of them have actually used what we call conflict diamonds to fund a lot of the movements and the governments. And again, this can be enslavement of different groups of people. This still happens today, especially with a lot of people fleeing countries to try and immigrate and being returned. Um, if you look at Northern Africa slave trade, recently there's been a big call for attention of Nigerians, largely Nigerians who are in the north of Africa and have been trying to get to Europe and are stuck there or detained and put in detainee centers and then are actually being sold into slavery. So your book goes into this quite a bit more. I'm not going to bore you and make you listen to me ramble on about it. But conflict time is a really good example. And this is something that most people, there's been a bit of a Western call of attention to this situation, and people are now trying, you might have heard of conflict-free diamonds, where people are trying to guarantee, businesses are using this as like a eco or green washing, if you will, a peace washing, and trying to promote their diamonds as being conflict-free diamonds. So economic and social development. I think we'll just keep going. This is our last part. We just got a couple minutes left. So again, you can see we have a lot of countries in this world. We've got divided between southern, central, eastern, and western Africa. All of this is sub-Saharan Africa. This is the world's poorest region. So the GNI per capita, this is based on the PPP. So when we break it down and put everybody's income more or less on the same level, right? You get all the way down at the bottom. Zimbabwe was 1,600, 750 for Malawi. And then like Equatorial Guinea is at 23,000, so huge disparities. What else do we have? Is that the highest one? Seychelles is also about 23,000. GDP, so the average annual growth, this is 2009 to 2013. Again, pretty high growth rates for some of them, up to 9, 10, and non-existent. Central African Republic actually was -5, so huge disparities there. Human Development Index, remember this was an index based on a variety of variables, healthcare, education, literacy rates. So it was 0 to 1, the higher the number, the higher the development. So pretty low. Cape Verde has 0.636. Trying to see if there's anything higher. 0.77, Mauritius, 0.756, Seychelles. But generally speaking, it can be pretty low for a lot of the countries. Percent living below $2 a day, very high. 74, 75%, 50%, 78%. Burundi, 93.5%. Madagascar, 95.1%. So very high percentage of the population living on less than $2 a day. Life expectancies, this was in 2015. Life expectancies is generally in the 50s and 60s. 73 for Seychelles. And then, let me see, Southern Africa tends to be a little bit lower. Again, this is largely southern and central is going to largely be affected by HIV/AIDS as well. Age 5 mortality rates. So this was in 1990, and then if you compare it with 2013, you can see there's a drastic reduction. Burkina Faso in 1990, the second one on the list was 2008, and then it pops down to 98. That's a drastic reduction. There has been a drastic reduction, but when you look at the last column from just 5 years ago, it was still pretty high. Somalia was at 146, not a huge reduction. Angola was 167, so still really quite high under age 5 mortality rates. Youth literacy rates, so people between the ages of 15 and 24, pretty low. If you look at Western Africa, pretty darn low for a lot of those countries. The highest one, Mauritius has 98, Equatorial Guinea has 98, South Africa has 99. So very low youth literacy rates. And again, partially, a lot of this is related to education and access to education, which we'll talk about. And then gender equality. Again, it's kind of across the board. 0.617 for Zambia, 0.375 for Mauritius, so quite a huge disparity. So part of understanding why this region is so poor, there's a lot of different factors. To kind of break it down for you quickly and easily, there's a lot of historical and institutional factors. So think about colonization and colonial legacies. Slave trade, a lot of people were removed. There's still a lot of internal issues that are related to slavery. Colonization, poor infrastructure. So these weren't regions where people went in, it's not like Latin America where the Spaniards went in and mixed with the locals and had children with the locals and established cities. They were largely coastal cities where they exported things from, and it was a lot of indirect rule. A lot of failed development policies, so structural adjustment programs that we talked about with Jamaica, talked a little bit about with the Caribbean. So countries are forced into these programs, we'll talk about here in a minute as well, for debt relief. But a lot of countries are forced into, okay, we'll loan you money to do this certain project, but you can't spend money on healthcare and education. You have to spend your money repaying our debt. And then corruption. So what we refer to as kleptocracy. So kleptocracy is a state where corruption is so institutionalized that politicians and bureaucrats siphon off huge percentages of countries' wealth. This is not the only region that it happens in, but this is a very pervasive problem in this region. We are seeing huge signs of economic growth. So there has been a lot of domestic and international aid that goes into the region. This is also evident in the growth in cellular and digital technology. Might not be something that we think about, but the people who have access to cell phones have access now to internet. That's a huge sign. And we've seen a huge surge in new infrastructure. So down here we have, for example, a huge solar power farm, massive amount of land that it covers. So there is a lot of signs of growth and a lot of signs of hope. However, the region is generally only connected to about 2% of global trade. So there's very limited trade connections, external, so talking about it from a global scale. There's also been a lot of increasing Chinese investment. Your book talks about this a little bit as well, but Chinese investment, this region is very mineral rich, has a lot of potential natural resources. By investing in this region, then they are creating types of agreements with China to create exporting agreements, for example. Talk a little bit about some of their other global linkages. Aid, so global aid and financial aid versus investment. Aid is providing funds to a country. It could be for healthcare, for education, providing food, where investment is actually establishing something. The best way I can think of it is if you teach somebody to fish, they eat for a day. Or sorry, if you give somebody a fish, they eat for a day. If you did I say that right? Sorry. If you give somebody a fish to eat for a day, if you teach them to fish, they eat for a lifetime, right? So this is kind of the difference between aid versus investment. Actually making investments into the country, creating job opportunities. However, you can see here we have a map of the aid as the percent of the GNI. So the Liberia has 20% or higher in aid. Malawi as well, Burundi. So quite a lot of countries are getting a lot of their income as aid. And then we have 10 to 20% or 10 to 19.9% are the dark red countries, and it goes down from there. So if even South Africa is on here, it's less than 5%. And debt relief. So a lot of this is, these countries have been coerced more or less into accepting debt. And you can see here I have this stat for you. Many countries spend more than 6 times more money on debt repayment than on healthcare. So there's been this movement over the last few years to create a system of, they're so indebted. A lot of these countries are so indebted, they have no hopes of paying this back ever. And they're stuck paying off the debt, and they're not able to spend money on healthcare and education. So there's been a bit of an international movement to actually allow debt payments to go back into, to not have to be paid off. And I should say a lot of these countries are just paying the interests, not even paying all the interests. They're not even touching the actual debt themselves. So a lot of this money now, they're depending on how much a country owes and what its GDP is, they're allowing countries to redirect debt payments to infrastructure, healthcare, and education. So measuring social development, we are seeing huge improvements. Generally speaking, 1 out of 5 children dies before the age of 5, which is quite high, but it's getting better. Life expectancy can be as low as 40 years old. And malaria kills about 0.5 million kids per year. But there's been this movement largely by the United Nations Millennium Development Goals. And with this, there's a list of various goals that address healthcare, education, human rights. So there has been a big improvement in many ways in the country. And this has largely been focused on education and therefore relieving other areas through education. So again, we talked about 43% is under 15 in this region, but only 23% of teenagers are actually in high school. A very small percentage of kids who are high school eligible are actually in high school. 1/6 of the world's children are under 15. 1/6 of the world's children under 15 live in this region. That's a huge percentage. But half of the world's uneducated children are here. So let me rephrase that. It's only 1/6 of what we're classifying as children live in this region. But half of those children who don't have half of the world's education, half of the world's population of children who haven't or don't have access to education, live in this region. And there is a huge disparity between males versus females and their access to education. And so just talk a little bit about women in development. It is a very patriarchal society, but it's also very matriarchal depending on which country you're in. So a lot of women are what they're calling invisible contributors. There are countries that have female presidents and female assembly members or senators, for example. Um, but again, they're not, there's a huge disparity, right? And women are largely involved in the local economies, but not necessarily, again, it's an invisible contributor as well as what they're referring to. So it might be indirectly contributing to the economy. And then there is, so while there is a lot of equality for women in the region, ironically, some particular countries, it's still common practice for polygamy, child marriage, so young children, young females being married. Female circumcision is still very common in a lot of countries, and some countries are very hesitant to make it illegal. And then in more remote areas, again, there's still a lot of lack of opportunities for women, education, access to education. Some of the trends we've been seeing in like Boko Haram areas, or other Islamist areas or Islamic areas that have Sharia law, is that women, children are not allowed, or sorry, girls are not allowed to go to school as well. So there's a lot. It's a very vast region, a lot of differences from one area to the next. A lot of a lot of children left as orphans because of the rate of HIV/AIDS as well. Yet we do see in a lot of countries they're still pretty good. So this will show you probably more so than the country, but the number of women in parliament. So again, as we talked about, great disparities, right? Some countries have, Rwanda has 64% are women, whereas Swaziland has 6. So not sure how this would compare to the United States. Actually, probably a lot of these countries are doing quite better than we are. And finally, I think I'd like to kind of try and leave this region off with a bit of a positive spin, because a lot of people, we don't hear a lot of good things coming from this region. A lot of Africans are very optimistic about their future. A lot of people are still trying to flee the region and the country, but there is still a lot of prospects and possibilities for continuing to improve the economic and social as well as political situation. Some of the hopeful developments that we've seen over the past 10 years or so is a shift in a lot of countries from authoritarian states to democracies. This is something you can constantly hear about in the news. Different elections that are constantly happening, and whether or not that they are, if the people are willing to accept them. If there's been a lot of effective targeted aid projects. There's some really good projects with bed nets, providing shoes. There's the shoe that grows is a really good project as well. A lot of different, like if you think of the Sahel, a lot of different movements to try and increase people's access to well waters. A lot of support of small businesses and investments. There's it's a crowdsourced funding called Kiva, Kiva. With a $25 donation, you can help provide funds for people around the world. I use it, and I've helped provide funds for a few small businesses in Africa and a couple different countries. And there's definitely a desire to increase connectivity to the outside world as well. So here's your review. And again, just the slides, you have it available. And please let me know if you have any questions. Have a great week.